Overview: How to describe an impact and occupant effectively to the trauma team. Presented by Joel McWilliams, BA, Senior Crash Investigator, International Center for Automotive Medicine, on behalf of Dr. Stuart Wang. The purpose of this module is to provide you with an introduction to automotive trauma that will teach you how to assess the crash vehicle and accurately report the impact type, impact severity, automotive or non-medical status of each occupant, prioritize initial triage efforts based on crash factors, and to describe the crash to other professionals so as to convey essential information accurately and efficiently. Globally, motor vehicle crashes cause 1.3 million deaths per year worldwide, 20 to 50 million injuries per year worldwide. It is currently the number 9 global health problem according to WHO, and predicted to be the number 5 global health problem by the year 2030. It is the leading cause of death for 15 to 29-year-olds worldwide. In the United States, 2009 data shows that 30,800 people were killed in car crashes. That's 84 per day, or 1 every 17 minutes. 2.2 million crashes are injury crashes. 5.5 million total crashes in the United States in 2009, at an estimated cost of $230 billion. To give you a little history, in 1975, less than half the vehicles actually had a seatbelt available. In 1975, roughly 5% of us actually wore a seatbelt. Also in 1975, we injured 185 people for every 100 million vehicle miles traveled, and we had a fatality rate of 2.5 people per every 100 million vehicle miles traveled. Compared to 2009 statistics, nearly every car has a seatbelt now, 99.9% compared to less than 50%. The belt use rate is roughly 85% compared to 5%. Injury rate has been more than cut in half, currently standing at 74 injuries per every 100 million vehicle miles traveled. The fatality rate has also been cut in half, 1.13 deaths per every 100 million vehicle miles traveled. Again, in the United States, there was 5.5 million crashes in 2009. 71% are non-injury crashes, your typical fender benders where everybody drives home. 28%, however, involve injury crashes, and less than 1% are actually fatal crashes. When we look at that 5.5 million crashes, we also note that 2/3 are multiple vehicle crashes where more than one car was involved, and 1/3 are single vehicle crashes. Those 5.5 million crashes, 48% are frontal impacts, 28% are side impacts, 22% are rear impacts, and 2% are either rollovers or other types, such as vehicle immersion and fires. Of the 2.2 million injury crashes in 2009, 44% are frontal impacts, 27% are side impacts, 23% are rear impacts, and 6% are rollover or other type impacts. Roughly 34,000 people killed in crashes during 2009. 57% are in frontal impacts, 25% are in side impacts, 6% are in rear impacts, and 11% are in rollovers or other impact types. Any given impact can best and quickly be described in 4 basic parts. 1. Principal direction of force. 2. A general or gross impact type. 3. A specific subcategory of that impact. And 4. The severity of the impact. Before we get started in that, I'd like to cover some common vehicle nomenclature, or parts that you might use to describe where an impact occurred. In this slide, you can see the A-pillar, which starts at the upper portion of the windshield, runs down the side of the windshield, and then down where the door hinges. The B-pillar is where the door latches, or striker plate, is located. The C-pillar is the next pillar rearward, which may be at a door or at the vehicle end, depending on the type of vehicle, and each pillar after that gets a letter designation. Fenders are also in the front of the vehicle, and quarter panels are in the rear, thus eliminating the need to say front fender or rear fender. If you just say fender, it implies front, quarter panel implies rear. The greenhouse area, as depicted inside the yellow shading on this slide, is everything above the windowsill level and where your shoulders and head of the occupants are. Roof side rail is on both sides of the vehicle, defining the edges of the roof. Principal direction of force, or PDOF. The PDOF is a force vector that's applied to a clock face to describe the directionality of an impact and is as important as the type of impact. Basic logic applies to this formula. You cannot have a 12 o'clock impact to the rear, nor can you have a 6 o'clock impact to the front, nor a 3 o'clock impact to the left, nor a 9 o'clock impact to the right. PDOF is important because it dictates the occupant response. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The occupant response is equal and opposite to that of the PDOF. As you can see from this slide, the PDOF coming from a 10 o'clock direction of force, all the occupants want to move in a straight line opposite of that path. How do you assess the PDOF in a front or rear impact? We've come up with a handy tool to do that. I call it the Superman Wonder Woman tool. It's quick and it's easy to determine the PDOF or an o'clock direction for an impact. If you're standing in front of a damaged vehicle, visualize that you're a Superman or Wonder Woman. Grab a known point with one finger, typically a bumper center or a bumper corner, and pull in a straight direction to repair the deformation and restore the vehicle to an undamaged state. This line reasonably represents the o'clock or PDOF of the impact. Also, that line represents the path that unsecured cargo or unbelted occupants will travel. In this slide, you can see the Superman technique applied. The upright line represents the center line of the vehicle for reference, and as you note, the M in the GMC is far to the right side of that. If you pulled it toward you and back to the left, that is your PDOF. In these three examples, you can see from the top view an 11 o'clock and two 1 o'clock PDOFs. Assessing the PDOF for side impacts is a little tougher. You have to read the damage pattern. You will need to determine if the damage is primarily lateral, going inboard, or primarily longitudinal, displaced rearward more than inboard. One key is to use the opposite side component to compare and determine if there was any longitudinal movement. For example, look at the B-pillar that's damaged and look across the vehicle. Is the B-pillar rearward, forward, or simply lateral compared to the other B-pillar? Other clues provide predominant lateral forces. There's no change in the wheelbase. The top of the wheel is bent over and inboard as opposed to displaced rearward. Indicates primarily lateral forces. Longitudinal forces would include door seams that overlap, rearward axle movement, changes in the angle of the A-pillar. If an impact is primarily a lateral crush pattern, then select 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock depending on which side of the vehicle you're standing on. If you see some lateral and some longitudinal, select 10 o'clock or 2 o'clock depending on which side of the vehicle. This slide shows a 270-degree 9 o'clock impact, all lateral crush, no longitudinal component whatsoever. Another example of a 270-degree PDOF 9 o'clock impact. Note that it's all lateral crush and no rearward movement of the door at all. This example shows a right-sided 60-degree or 2 o'clock impact. Note the separation at the A-pillar of the door frame, as well as the overlapping of the front door over the back door, as well as the rear door over the quarter panel. Gross or general impact types. There are 4 basic types of impacts: frontal impacts, side impacts, rear impacts, and rollover impacts. You should be aware that many crashes involve multiple impacts. You should attempt to determine the main injury-producing event. Impact types. These are determined by the first plane crossed by the opposing vehicle or object. Angled impacts on a corner of a vehicle are difficult. As a rule of thumb, if the damage is longer along the fender than it is along the bumper, choose side impact. If the area of damage is longer on the bumper versus the fender, choose a front or rear impact. There are several subcategories of frontal impacts. We've limited it to just 4 types today: full frontal, offset frontal, frontal central, and narrow frontal corner. Full frontal impacts are impacts which involve both bumper corners. The entire front end is contacted by the opposing vehicle or object, as seen in this example. An offset frontal impact involves one bumper corner but not the other. It could be 1% or 99%, but typically anything over 80% is considered a full frontal. The example on the left shows a 50% right vehicle overlap. The image on the right shows an 80% left vehicle overlap. Frontal centrals. These are impacts where the damage is inboard of both bumper corners. It's typically less than 1/3 of the entire width of the bumper and is most commonly associated with poles and posts and small to medium tree impacts, although sometimes motorcycle impacts can fall into this category too. Narrow frontal corner impacts. These are crashes or impacts where the damage begins at a bumper corner but does not go inboard of the hood edge or the fender seam. Typically, this is less than 16 inches, and if you do the calculation, they're usually less than a 20% vehicle overlap. These impacts typically displace the front tire rearward or tear it right off of the axle. There is usually significant damage to the fender, A-pillar, and door as the opposing vehicle or object penetrates longitudinally down the side of the struck vehicle. In this example, you can see about a 15% overlap to the right front corner, lots of rearward displacement of the instrument panel, as well as rearward displacement of the right front tire. Moving on to side impacts. 3 subcategories of side impacts exist: a T-type impact, an L-type impact, and a narrow or pole-type impact. T-type impact on the right or left side is mostly to the passenger compartment area, in between the front and rear pillars. One or both doors may have been impacted. Typically, this is a result of vehicle-to-vehicle impacts, such as in intersection crashes, but also larger trees, buildings, and other objects can cause this type of damage. Here are 2 examples of a T-type impact. You can see the damage starts behind the A-pillar, but stops short of the rear passenger compartment. An L-type impact on the right or left side typically starts at one bumper corner and is mostly forward or rearward of the passenger compartment. The impact essentially occurs mostly to the fender or to the quarter panel. These are typically less injurious impacts for most occupants. Here are a couple of examples: a L-type to the front left and an L-type to the rear left. Narrow impacts to the right or left side are typically concentrated in an area generally less than 16 inches in width. Typically, a pole or tree is the opposing object for these types of impacts. In this example, you can see a Ford Mustang that's been impacted by a pole right at the door on the right side. See the significant reduction in wheelbase size? Another tree impact to the left side, right into the driver's door. Rear impacts have 4 subcategories: full rear, offset rear, narrow rear central, and narrow rear corner. Essentially, these are the same as the front except for to the rear of the vehicle. This example shows a full rear impact where the entire rear end is contacted by the opposing vehicle or object. An offset rear is typically less than 80% of the rear end being contacted by the opposing vehicle or object, and at least one bumper corner is involved but not both. This example shows a 40% left rear vehicle overlap. A narrow rear central impact is defined by an impact that occurs inside of the bumper corners. Typically, it's under 16 inches wide, and it's usually caused by a tree, pole, or post. Narrow rear corner impacts, much like narrow front corner impacts, begin at a bumper corner but does not get inboard of the trunk, hatch edge, or quarter panel seam. Damage is typically less than 16 inches wide. Typically, rear tire is displaced forward or torn off the axle. Significant damage to the quarter panel, C-pillar, and/or rear door as the opposing vehicle or object penetrates longitudinally up the side of the vehicle. This example shows a left rear narrow corner impact. You can see the damage to the pillar and to the rear seat area. The left rear door has been torn off. Subcategories of rollover impacts include low-speed rolls and high-speed rolls. A low-speed roll is typically less than 4 quarter turns, meaning the vehicle went over onto its side or roof, perhaps the other side, or maybe one complete revolution, but no more. The area from where the vehicle tripped and started its roll to its final rest is typically less than 30 meters. There is minimal or no greenhouse movement or intrusions. There is minimal glass or window breakage. This is an example of a low-speed roll. There is no significant distortion of the greenhouse area, little or no window breakage, and little or no intrusions. A high-speed roll is typically more than 4 quarter turns. The area from where the vehicle trips to its final rest is long and is usually 40 or more meters. There is significant roof or greenhouse movement and intrusions both vertically and/or lateral. These 2 examples are extremely high-speed rollovers. Note how the roof is at the same level as the hood or trunk. The bottom example involves a convertible, so the entire windshield area is flattened right to the level of the door. Other key descriptors of rollover impacts that you should note are interrupted rollovers, and that is any rollover that is abruptly stopped due to an impact with another object in the environment. Typically this is a tree or a large rock. Sometimes it's another car, sometimes it's a house. Here's an example of a car from both sides that rolled into a tree and stopped. Note that the roof is crushed down to the level of the window. Another example of an interrupted rollover into a tree. This vehicle rolled into a tree, resulting in crush halfway down through the vertical height of the door. Impact severity. In many places we would talk about severity in terms of miles per hour, kilometers per hour, etc. We don't expect you to do that. We just want to have a gross indicator only: minor, moderate, and severe. Here's an example of a minor frontal. The vehicle is almost always drivable, there is no change in the wheelbase, they're representative of low speed and low energy collisions. A minor side has no wheelbase reduction, 4 inches or less of crush and intrusion, and the vehicle is almost always drivable. A minor rear involves minimal trunk or rear bumper deformation, no wheelbase reduction, the vehicle is drivable, and this accounts for the majority of rear impacts. A minor rollover has no or minimal greenhouse deformation. A moderate frontal impact almost always requires the vehicle to be towed from the scene. There is usually no intrusion or very minimal intrusion to the passenger compartment. A moderate side impact usually involves 4 to 6 inches of door crush and intrusion, minimal or no wheelbase reduction. Doors may be jammed, but the occupant is not entrapped, meaning physically pinned into the vehicle by some component. Moderate rear impact involves moderate trunk and bumper deformation, typically not drivable, some wheelbase reduction, and minimal intrusion, typically limited to the cargo area or the area behind the rear seat. A moderate rollover, you'll begin to notice roof intrusion, but this is less than 6 inches to the greenhouse area. Severe front. Vehicles almost always require towing. The wheelbase is visibly reduced. The occupant compartment intrusion is visually obvious. One or both A-pillars will move to a more vertical position, and the steering wheel rim is oftentimes deformed, even by a belted driver. Here are 2 more examples of severe frontal impacts, both of which are to trees. A severe side impact is indicative by 6 inches or more of door crush or intrusion. The roof is buckled. There's obvious wheelbase reduction on the struck side and elongation on the far side. The vehicle may actually bow and become shaped much like a banana. The seat cushion, seat backrest are often deformed on the struck side, and the occupant may become entrapped. This is very common for near-side occupants. A severe rear impact involves significant damage to the trunk, rear bumper, and hatch. There is obvious wheelbase reduction and or restricted rear wheels, meaning that they won't turn anymore. There is remote buckling of the roof and rear doors and jamming of the front doors. The rear seat is typically the most intruded area. Occasionally the front row seat backs deformed and bend rearward in a severe rear impact. A severe rollover involves significant greenhouse deformation of 1 foot or more. To summarize our automobile descriptors, there are 4 basic descriptors for an impact: the PDUF or O-clock direction of force, the general or gross impact type, the subcategory of the impact type, and the severity of the impact. Here's an example. This crash is best described as a 12 o'clock severe right narrow corner offset frontal impact. In this example, it's best described as a 2 o'clock moderate right-sided L impact. This example is best described as a 12 o'clock moderate left narrow offset corner impact with 20% vehicle overlap. This impact is best described as a 1 o'clock severe right L-type impact. Note the vertical position of the right A-pillar. Other potential automobile descriptors. There are other descriptors worth noting, such as an override-underride type of an impact. Mostly we are interested in the underride as these result in more serious injuries. Damage is typically above the frame of the vehicle and may involve a greenhouse impact or deformation. The bumper is typically not engaged and not severely deformed. Occupant automotive status, non-medical. Besides all the medical terminologies, occupant information can also be described in 4 basic parts: seating location, restraint status, safety systems deployed, and post-crash status. You should try to get into a standardized method of determining and reporting where a person was seated. The driver or left front is oftentimes referred to as LF or 1L. If there's a center position in the front seat, this is often referred to as first row center or 1C, or center front. The right front position is RF, first row right, or 1R. The person behind the driver is typically referred to as the left rear, or second row left, or 2L position. Center rear is also referred to as the second row center, 2C, or center rear. Right rear is also known as the right rear, second row right, or 2R. Some vehicles have 3 and 4 rows, and the logic applies. Third row left, 3L. Fourth row right, 4R. Anyone who's not in a seat but in the cargo area behind the rear seat should not be considered seated and just refer to them as being in the cargo area. Other positional descriptors include referring to someone as a near-side occupant or a far-side occupant. In frontal or rear impacts, this refers to occupants that are on the struck half of the vehicle. So if it's a right-sided frontal offset, the right front passenger is near side, the driver is far side. In side impacts, people sitting closest to the side struck are near side and people sitting up across from them are far side. Restraint status. By restraint, we are only referring to seat belts as well as child seats. Restrained means that the seat belt was in use. Unrestrained means the seat belt was not in use. Unknown is an option. Improperly restrained means someone put the belt admittedly behind their shoulder, under their arm, or behind their back. This is a rare occurrence, but if someone tells you this, please note it. Restrained in a child safety seat means 2 things. The child is restrained in the seat, and the seat is attached to the vehicle. If either of these conditions are not met, the child is unrestrained. This slide shows you how to look at the D-ring and determine if there was belt use. This is pretty obvious in moderate and severe frontal impacts. Note the abrasions on the plastic of the D-ring. This is the latch plate that goes into your receiver. It too has plastic abrasions where the belt slides through and gets irritated during a frontal impact. The belt webbing also leaves a lot of marks. If you examine, you will find many. The one on the left shows an angled mark from the D-ring. The one in the center, again, angled mark from the D-ring. And the one on the far right is actually a skin transfer from someone's neck. Down on the floor where the belt attaches, there is oftentimes load limiters. These are little loops sewn into the fabric that give under certain load conditions, indicating that the maximum load was reached. This slide and all the damage to the seatbelt system were caused by a 26-pound toddler in a 30-mile-an-hour impact. Only report deployed systems for the occupant's seating position. Don't tell us about other airbags that went off that are not related to where this person was seated. Safety systems that can deploy currently involve frontal airbags, knee airbags, seat-mounted side airbags, side curtain airbags, and center cab airbags. Frontal airbags come out of 2 places, the steering wheel or the dashboard in front of the right front passenger. Knee airbags are a new technology and are only now showing up in the current fleet. They deploy out of the lower dashboard below the steering wheel and provide reduction of forces to the thigh and hip. Seat-mounted airbags deploy from the outboard edge of the front seats, sometimes the rear seats. In this picture, you see that this is a head and torso airbag meant to cover and provide protection to the head as well as the thorax. There are smaller ones that are only designed to protect the thorax. They come in several shapes and sizes. Side curtain airbags deploy from the roof rail in a downward path. They are on the right and left sides and may deploy independently or together. They typically cover both the front and rear seats on either side. Some of these may be rollover type airbags versus side impact airbags, but you probably won't be able to tell that in the field. Just refer to these bags as curtain airbags. Center cab airbags, a brand new technology. These deploy from the inboard side of the seat back, typically the driver's seat, and are designed to prevent occupant-to-occupant contact and side impacts. Post-crash status. What we mean here is what happened to the person in this position. Were they ejected partially or completely? Were they trapped or physically pinned down inside the vehicle, not just jammed doors? And was there any intrusion in their seating area, and how much? Ejection, whether partial or complete, is important. People who are partially or completely ejected have large areas of abrasions and road rash. They are avulsive in nature, soft tissue wounds, or macerating wounds. Their clothes, shoes, and other accessories are typically ripped right off of their body. They have dirt, mud, sod, and grass present in their hair, in their clothes, in their wounds, and other body parts. Entrapment refers to someone who is physically pinned in by the vehicle, such as a leg, arm, thigh, or other body region which has been immobilized that requires extrication. Jammed doors alone do not qualify as entrapment. Intrusions. Interior components that are deformed and displaced inboard reduce the occupant space as compared to the undamaged vehicle. Report all these intrusions in individual occupant seat locations. Report maximum intrusions as well wherever it occurs in the vehicle. Report intrusions as greater than 12 inches or less than 12 inches. A good rule of thumb is the distance from your elbow to your wrist is about 12 inches. The four basic descriptors of the occupant are, therefore, the seating position within the vehicle, their restraint use, belted or not, airbag deployment, this may be multiple airbags, and entrapment or intrusion in the occupant's position. Here's a summary example. This case is best described as the patient is the left front or driver who is unrestrained with a steering wheel airbag deployment, far side occupant in a 12 o'clock severe right narrow corner offset frontal impact. This example is best described as follows. The patient is an unbelted driver or left front far side occupant with steering wheel airbag deployment who was involved in a 2 o'clock moderate right-sided L-type impact in which he was partially ejected through the right windshield. In this example, we would describe as follows. The patient is the driver or left front occupant who was belted with a steering wheel airbag and seat-mounted airbag which deployed in his position. He was involved in a 12 o'clock moderate left narrow offset corner impact, 20% vehicle overlap, involving a foot or more of intrusion in the left front footwell area. Another example. This patient is the right front near side passenger who was belted with a dashboard-mounted airbag deployment, who was involved in a 1 o'clock severe right-sided L-type impact that resulted in more than a foot of dashboard and footwell intrusion with lower leg entrapment requiring extrication. Note the vertical position of that right A-pillar. You'll have many things on your mind as you roll up to a crash scene. One of the things I can tell you, though, is between vehicles, you should prioritize. Go to the vehicle with the greatest amount of intrusion or deformation first. If everything is equal, go to the smaller vehicle first. If everything is equal, go to the side-impacted vehicle first, in particular the near-side occupants. After that, go to the frontal-impacted vehicles, the severe rollover vehicles, the side-impacted vehicles with far-side occupants, rear-impacted vehicles, followed by minor and moderate rollover vehicles. Within an individual vehicle, you should prioritize by the occupant with the greatest amount of intrusion into their space. Secondly, go to the occupant that's nearest the area of greatest crush. Also, unbelted occupants are probably going to be in worse shape than belted ones, as are improperly belted occupants. And again, the two extremes of age, the very young and very old. Some important take-home points. The crash and the vehicle information that you see at the scene is essential to properly triaging the patient. This information should help you predict the most likely injured body region, and properly relaying this information to medical control and to the medical team will assist them with the proper assessment and care of the patient. Time is of the essence. Accuracy of crash information is critical. Thank you for your attention.